All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So before we jump into our content today, just a little housekeeping. Remember that these webinars are intended for educational purposes only, and while we hope that you learn new information, the trainers that present these webinars are not attorneys. Therefore, all information provided during the presentation as well as the Q&A session should not be construed as legal advice. All right, well, with that out of the way, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Brianna Grimes, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar today where we're going to be talking about creating an effective employee handbook for 2021. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them into the question box, and they'll be addressed during our Q&A session at the end. With that being said, let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about today. All right, well, today we are going to be talking about what an employee handbook is and what its purpose is, the components of an effective employee handbook, the top 5 handbook mistakes that are commonly made for employers, employee handbook best practices, and should you update your handbook for 2021? So we're going to talk about how to determine if your handbook is due for an update, and then we will finish off with a Q&A session. All right, so before we start talking about specifics regarding employee handbooks, I want to begin with talking about what an employee handbook is and its purpose for employers. So the number one way to ensure that your handbook is effective for your business is to really understand its purpose in your business. So we're going to start by looking at what an employee handbook is and why you even need it. So an employee handbook is, simply put, a resource for an organization's employees. That's really it. It's a very sophisticated and thorough communication tool between you and them. And it's a tool to help set employees up for success in their new role because it provides a lot of valuable information that they're going to need. Now, why do you need this complicated and sophisticated communication tool for your employees, you may ask? Well, it's simple. The purpose of the handbook is for you as the employer to provide clear expectations for the employee during their employment, demonstrate your culture and your generosity to your employees, and inform them of their rights under state and federal laws. That's really it. All of the components that make up an employee handbook can be categorized into one of these 3 categories. Let's take a look at them each individually. So the first category is setting expectations. Now, William Shakespeare once wrote that expectation is the root of all heartache, and boy, was he right. Expectations can create heartaches, especially in the workplace. It can even create headaches when expectations are not communicated properly. For example, when we first hire a new employee, we have high hopes for this person. They ace the interview, everyone in the company loves them, they're happy, they're excited, and they're ready to join your team. As a result, we as employers tend to have high expectations that they're going to perform well. However, what we tend to forget is that if we don't communicate our expectations of these new employees effectively, then they'll never be able to meet those expectations. In fact, a vast majority of the time, as you may guess, an employee doesn't accept a job with your company with the intent of getting fired. No one starts a job saying, wow, I love my new job, but I really hope I get let go at the end of my probationary period. Most employees want to do well, but they have to be given the opportunity to succeed, and that is where this communication tool comes into play. The policies that are housed in this category are the biggest and the most important component of the employee handbook because they provide the employee with clear expectations ranging from your attendance policies to your organization's mission and values. The second category is demonstrating your company's culture. This is another important part of the employee handbook because it allows the organization to demonstrate what they are all about, the type of people they want to hire, and what you offer to retain your top talent. Your employees are essentially your human capital, and it's important to remember that your business could not function without them. Many studies show us that millennials and Gen Zs are more interested in their employer's values and mission more than any generation before them. These 2 generations will make up 64% of the workforce by 2025. That's only 4 years away. So it's really important to pay attention to these trends to make sure that you have an effective and engaging employee handbook in order to hire and retain the right employees. Additionally, it's important to specifically highlight what your organization offers to make you different and competitive in your market. Do you offer generous PTO plans? Awesome, put it in your handbook. Do you offer childcare stipend because you want to encourage working parents to have a work-life balance? Great, that needs to go in your handbook too. All of these types of benefits and perks that you offer your employees can help you attract the right type of employee and help you retain the right employee to grow your organization. If your organization tends to have a lot of turnover and you tend to lose a lot of employees to your competitors, you may want to consider looking at your overall pay and benefits packages. Are you offering employees additional incentives or competitive incentives to choose you as their employer? And finally, the last category is sections of the handbook that provide information regarding an employee's state and federal rights. Of course, outside of the other two components, this is the most content-heavy component of an employee handbook. There are a lot of laws that both the federal government and individual states, even cities, mandate that must be included in your employee handbook. Ultimately, it is the responsibility of the employer to inform employees of their rights and provide this information. These sections offer legal protections to the employees because if they know their rights, they're more likely to speak up when employers are violating them. However, on the flip side, this component also offers just as much, if not more, protection for employers than it does employees. The Employee Handbook acts as an active document that employees should have access to anytime they need it. Therefore, you can hold them accountable to its contents just as much as they're able to hold you accountable to the contents. In addition, revising and re-releasing your employee handbook every 2 years at a minimum increases your protection as an organization. Here's an example. If you had an employee who had been with your company for, say, 6 years, and they decided to file a wrongful termination claim, you would have extra protection if you updated your employee handbook 3 times during their employment period instead of just once. They would be less likely to be successful if they played the "I didn't know that was expected of me" card, because there's documentation that they signed and acknowledged your handbook 3 times during the course of their employment. That kind of documentation offers huge assistance for employers in the event of litigation claims. So before we talk more about the benefits of updating your employee handbook, let's look at the top 5 mistakes employers make with regards to their handbooks. The first most common mistake that many employers make is not including a mission, vision, and value statement in their handbook. Many employers don't have one or don't even bother to include one in the handbook. This section is so incredibly important. To best illustrate this concept, think of your relationship with your new hires like adding a new friend on Facebook. So picture this. You met this person at coffee at a networking group, talked to them a bit, thought that they were cool, and now you want to invite them into your friends or your network group. So you find them on Facebook and you click Add Friend. Well, this person sees your request and they go to your profile to accept your friend request, but wait, when they go to your profile, there's no picture, no About Me section, no photos, and nothing. What your profile does contain is a name, some legal warnings pertaining to being friends with you, and some rules you want them to abide by, otherwise they'll unfriend you. Wow, is that really someone you want to choose to be friends with? Someone who may or may not value their friends? The same goes for your employees, and your profile is your employee handbook. You need to make an effort to pack some personality and culture into the handbook. Tell your new hires what your company stands for and the values. Why do you do the business that you do? What are you passionate about? Do you admire things like hard work, integrity, honesty, and being a team player? That's awesome if you do, but you have to make sure that your employees know what your values are. And how do you know that you're attracting the type of candidate with those values if it's not obvious? To get started, you definitely don't have to have all 3 of these things. I always recommend starting with at least your core values because that one's the easiest to develop. And it helps to let your employees know who you are, what you stand for, and why they should be excited to come work for your organization. The second most common mistake is when your policies don't match what you practice day to day. This is a huge issue and it can cause a lot of legal trouble for employers. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with a client to update their handbook, and during a meeting, I make a recommendation regarding a policy change, and I've heard the response, well, that isn't really how we do it anyways. That is a huge red flag when I hear that. If there's one thing that you take away from this whole webinar today, I want you to remember the words I'm about to share with you. When you create and implement an employee handbook, you are responsible for upholding its contents as if it were law. And here's why. If you ever find yourself in any type of a litigation situation, the number one source of accountability for employers comes from the employee handbook, regardless of when it was created. If you're practicing policies and procedures differently from what is written in your employee handbook, then there goes a large portion of your documentation defense down the drain. So please, if you do not do so already, I encourage you to read through your handbook at the very least once every year, cover to cover, to make sure that what you have written in it is still what you're doing in your daily operations. All right, mistake number 3 is when managers and supervisors are not trained on the contents of the employee handbook. This mistake usually goes hand in hand with the previous mistake. If your managers are not familiar with what is in the handbook, then they are not able to practice and enforce it. And consequently, there are legal ramifications when managers inappropriately respond to employee situations. For example, managers that are not trained to interview properly, address sexual harassment claims, or even leaves of absence claims correctly can result in fines, penalties, and even legal fees to your organization. It's important to remember that HR and the owners of the company are not the only ones who make up the company. The managers and employees count too. So just because you or your HR team put something in a handbook doesn't mean that your managers can't still get you in trouble if they violate your practices that you outlined in the handbook. Your company is still liable for any manager's actions, and in most cases, any that lead to litigation. In those cases, the employer is usually the one who pays for the mistakes. That is why manager training is so important, and I can't stress that enough. It's worth the investment in the long run because your managers will be running your teams according to your handbook and keeping those liabilities low. All right, fourth mistake is failing to adequately distribute and document the acknowledgement of the employee handbook. A handbook, like I said before, is a great tool. But what good is a tool if it's resting in your locked work shed out back because no one's using it? The employee handbook is the exact same thing. It's only fulfilling its purpose if the employees are using it as a resource. Therefore, the handbook should be provided to each employee at the time of hire and made available to them where it is easily accessible. In addition, they must sign a form acknowledging that they received, read, and understand the handbook's contents. And I know this seems like a no-brainer, but this form should be signed before they start their first day of work. If they've been working for you for 2 to 3 weeks and they still have not signed their handbook acknowledgement form, then you don't really have documented grounds to hold them accountable to anything in the handbook because there's no documentation showing they ever received it. This situation opens you up for a huge amount of liability. This practice should be repeated every time you revise and roll out an updated handbook. Best practice is to notify your new employees, or all of your employees in writing that you have a new handbook and it's going to be distributed. Also include a brief explanation of what sections they should review due to the changes and have every active employee sign an updated handbook acknowledgement form. This new form that they sign each time will supersede all previous forms. Following this process is key to successfully implementing a new handbook. And finally, the fifth top handbook mistake is omitting legally required policies or having illegal policies. I've reviewed a lot of handbooks in my 10-year career in HR, and I can honestly say that almost every single one I have reviewed was either missing a mandated policy, was missing a recent update to a policy, or they had policies in there that were not 100% legal. A lot of the time, you don't know what you don't know. There is a lot of laws out there, but that is one of the main benefits of getting your employee handbook reviewed and updated by a professional. Google and free handbook templates on the internet can really only get you so far. Employee handbooks all must include federal, state, city-based, and even industry-based laws. And unfortunately, a defense of, I didn't know about that law or that law didn't show up in my Google search won't hold up if you ever get sued. Like I said earlier, as an employer, it is your responsibility to educate yourselves on laws in order to provide the information to your employees. Now that we reviewed the top 5 mistakes, let's take a look at a few best practice tips for developing or reviewing an employee handbook. Like I talked about before, including your mission, vision, and or value statement to really sell your company to the new hire and tell them what you're about and why they should work for you is a great best practice to include in your handbook and to update over time. Another best practice is to format your handbook in a way that is easy to follow. If your handbook reads like a legal document where you must take breaks after every few pages or you're constantly looking up big words in the dictionary, then your handbook is not really written for an employee to use as a resource. The handbook should have a flow to it with an easy to read table of contents, so the employee can easily find the information they're looking for. All of your sections should also be clearly defined, and subsections should make logical sense in the way that they're categorized into the section headers. This also allows your handbook to do the work for you, so employees find the information they need without constantly having to reach out to their managers and bug HR for answers. Also, do not include specific processes in your handbook. A lot of employers confuse an employee handbook with a processes and procedures manual. You don't necessarily want to itemize every internal process and procedure in your employee handbook. Those types of sections really need to be placed into a separate internal document that only managers and HR has access to. Employees only need to know the information that pertains to them. They don't need to know specifics on how you process a leave request or the exceptions to your disciplinary policy. A little bit of ambiguity in your policies allow you as an employer to make decisions based on business need and the specific circumstances surrounding each situation. But that also comes with a balance. On the flip side, key policies such as discipline, timekeeping, overtime, and workplace rules must also be clear and specific. When it comes to key policies, especially those with federally or state mandated guidelines, they should be clear and specific. If you read the policy and you get confused, chances are your employees are going to be confused as well. Another indicator is if you get a lot of questions from employees about the same policy. If they're questioning it or it doesn't make sense to them, it may be a good idea to rework the language to be more understandable the next time you update your handbook. Remember that this is not a legal contract, it's a communication tool. And next is to outline all of your benefits so that they are easy to understand. I can't tell you how many times I've looked at a PTO policy that I've read, and it could be very, very simple because PTO usually isn't complicated, but employers find a way to complicate them. PTO does not have to be based on classification, average hours worked, tenure, and department. Usually it's best practice to choose one or two different ways of separating out benefits that you offer to your employees for different classifications and develop all of your policies from there. Additionally, it's a great idea to add in your special benefits that makes your company unique. For example, I used to work at Disneyland, and as an employee, I got to go into the park for free whenever I wanted. And I could also get up to 3 additional friends or family to come with me up to 10 visits per year. So that was a really cool benefit that they added, and it was included in our employee handbook. So if you offer things like that that are very special to your industry or special to your business, like casual dress Wednesdays or catered lunch on Friday, or maybe you offer floating holidays, any of those types of benefits should be included in your handbook. They're cool, they're fun, and they help new hires understand that you value your employees by offering them extra cool little benefits for working there. And finally, going along with the last tip, make sure that you put an effort to include your culture in the handbook. Now, I'm not talking about making your language or your policies based on your perception of your company culture. For example, quite a few years back, I did a handbook once where a gentleman who wrote it was, starting his new company, and he wanted a laid-back beachside company culture. His company was based out of California, and I kid you not, his timekeeping policy started out with the sentence, "All the dudes and chicks working for me need to keep track of their working time using whatever method they choose, as long as I know they're working and not surfing." Now, I'm sure that a lot of you can get a feel for that company's culture just based on that one sentence, but there were a lot of legal and compliance issues with that sentence. So, what we mean by including your culture is really weaving, your mission, vision, or values for your company throughout the handbook. So, if one of your values is integrity and you believe that employees should not be micromanaged, then you may have more of an honor system type things incorporated into some of your policies rather than strict policy language, especially if it comes to like attendance or time off. As an employer, you can really channel your company's culture and the culture of your employees into the policies that you have control over that aren't legally mandated. So, pretty much as long as you're not doing or saying anything illegal, there's a lot of wiggle room in your policies that you can customize. So we've covered a lot of information regarding what makes a great, effective, and engaging handbook. Now it's time to determine if a handbook update is the right next step for your company. So as we go through this, I want you all to self-reflect and answer each of the following questions. Have you updated your handbook in the last 2 years? Do you even know the last time you read or updated your handbook cover to cover? If the answer is no, or the date in your mind is prior to 2019, you should probably consider updating your handbook. Next question. Do you practice your policies as they are written? This includes your progressive disciplinary actions, your attendance policy, your benefits accrual, and benefits eligibilities. I want you all to go through and pick 3 random policies in your handbook and read them word for word. If they do not reflect how you execute your policies in your daily operations, you may need to update your handbook. Do you have handbook acknowledgments from all of your active employees in their personnel file? I challenge you to conduct an audit and choose 20 of your personnel files at random and check. If a lot of them are missing an acknowledgement or the acknowledgement is from prior to 2019, you should update and roll out your handbook again to secure that updated documentation. If you've never done an acknowledgement form in the past, then you should definitely update and roll out a new handbook in 2021 to get acknowledgments from all of your employees. Has your city or state had any legal updates since your handbook was last updated? Did you guys know that 25 of the United States had employment-related legal updates as a result of the 2020 elections? That's 50% of the states had updates, and that was only 3 months ago. Many of those updates did require new handbook policies or existing policies to be amended. So if your state had an update and a handbook change or addition is required, then you should use that as a gateway into updating your handbook for 2021. And final question. Has there been any major management, policy, or cultural change in your organization since the last time you updated your handbook? Did you acquire some new companies or possibly have an ownership change? Did you just take over your HR or operations department and you inherited an outdated handbook? Did your company make a switch culturally to retain more employees? Or did your company just hire some new employees from out of state or start hiring remote workers in other states that you didn't have employees in? If you answered yes to any of those questions, you definitely need to update your handbook. Based on your answers to these 5 questions, you should seriously consider a thorough handbook update and review in 2021. If you're interested in getting your handbook professionally updated, both Kathy and I offer handbook review and update services. So you can reach out to either of us at the end of this webinar to get pricing for a full handbook update or even a handbook creation if you don't currently have one. All right, so I know that was a lot of information, but feel free to take the time to type in any questions that you have inside the question box. And just as a reminder, this presentation was recorded and it will be available to watch again. Usually within 24 hours, the link is uploaded and you can visit our website at www.pantry.com and go up to the top webinars tab and go to webinar recordings. The most recent recording is almost always on top. So you should be able to access the recording there. And then you will also receive a copy of the webinar recording tomorrow afternoon. All right, so let's see if we have any questions.
Yes, we do. We have a few. One is for smaller family businesses, are there times when it's better not to issue a handbook?
Um, in terms of times, I'm thinking like not having a handbook versus having a handbook. That's how I'm interpreting the question. I would say even if you're a small family-owned business and you don't have a lot of employees, it's still a good idea to have a handbook. Even if you just have, the basic federal laws that apply to every organization with one or more employee, because there are certain things that you still have to abide by, even if you only have 2 or 3 employees. And then it's also good to have just kind of basic outlines on what's your attendance policy. What do they do if, they need to call out sick? What do they do, if one of your employees gets pregnant and, you have to offer a leave of absence, you need to work with them on, how many weeks off they get for having a baby. So there's a lot of things that are still really important, even to small businesses, that it would still be worth getting a handbook.
Okay. Brianna, would you say that there are specifics within the handbook that should be followed for everyone? Like, I
Um,
guess, consistent policies, or not policies, but consistent issues in handbooks.
Yes. So obviously all of your federally regulated laws should be consistent for everyone. You're talking about your EEO statement, your sexual harassment policy, your anti-discrimination policy, anti-retaliation policy, at-will policies. Those are pretty standard across the board. Realistically, outside of that, even within those policies, there are nuances from state to state. So, an EEO policy in California is going to look completely different than one in Florida. So, realistically, every handbook for every company is going to be nuanced. I don't think one handbook could fit multiple companies, just because of all the differences in attendance policies versus, state policies versus federal policies and things like that. So even if you were to take a handbook from another organization and use it for your own, you'd probably still find things that you would need to tweak because it just wouldn't work for your company or your state
And there are
for
some
that
things
matter.
like EEO policies or discrimination policies and things like that would be consistent between handbooks, right? I think I don't know
Depending
if
on
you
the state.
mentioned also, depending on state, I don't
Mhm.
know if you mentioned that there's a copy of this handout on the screen under handouts. It
Oh,
says
yes.
one of five. Um, Here's another question. What if someone refuses to sign the acknowledgement for the handbook?
So, depending on what state you're in, and there are only a few states that don't allow this, you can typically require the handbook acknowledgement as a, what is the phrase? You can require it as
Condition of
a
employment?
Thank you. Yes, a
Condition of
condition of
employment?
employment.
Yes.
So
Hmm.
you can give them a deadline, and if they don't sign by the deadline, you can suspend them and or terminate them. In certain states, like I would say Washington, California, probably New York, and I know there's a couple others that are a little bit more stringent on that, where it gets a little touchy. If you have a situation like that, you can always ask me and Kathy, and we can kind of walk you through the uniqueness of that situation. But for the most part, you can make it a condition of employment in most of the states.
Are there any templates to get me started?
Um, I know there are free templates online. Honestly, I haven't looked through a lot of them.
Um,
Um,
HR Answers has one.
yeah, HR Answers
Most of our
has,
clients have that. Yeah.
yeah, so if you have access to HR Answers, you can always go through their little wizard, I guess, and create a base handbook. Again, those only get you so far, and I really encourage, if you are going to use a basic template handbook, to go through it even after you've created it. And I would still read it to cover and change anything, like I said, that doesn't suit your organization. If you want to adjust the attendance policies or the benefit statement or the PTO policy, the way they have it worded, you can adjust it. I would just caution that any changes that you make, just make sure that you're not violating any state or federal regulations. So a lot of research goes into customizing your own handbook if you're going to do it 100% on your own.
Okay. There's someone on here that would like us to help them with their handbook, and we would love to do that. We'll reach out to you after this session is over.
Perfect.
There's a question here that says, given that laws can change frequently, do you recommend referring to external websites such as the state government for specifics on the laws rather than putting the text in the handbook itself?
No. So I would always recommend putting it in the handbook because the problem with linking it to other pages in your handbook or providing the information to your employees in other manners is that it's not documented. So, yes, you have a link on a printed document, but you can't verify that the employee ever visited that link and read the update. So, technically, you have no way to prove that they were notified of their rights. So, anytime there is a law change, that affects the handbook, and I'm going to preface this with not all laws require handbook updates. We just did a webinar series in December on all of the law updates that affected any states from the 2020 election. Some of them, we recommended an employment update or a handbook update. Others, it wasn't necessary. So realistically, that is going to depend on what law is being updated and if something in the handbook needs to be included to notify the employee. But I would definitely put the direct text into the handbook on what needs to be updated, what language needs to be in there, because again, it is your employer's responsibility to notify the employees of their rights. So giving them just a link or something like that, it's really not going to serve you from a documentation standpoint.
Okay, here's a question. We are a family business with additional non-family employees. Where do we find these federal policies that must be included?
So the
All over the
main,
place, right?
yeah, they're kind of all over the place because there's quite a few different federal policies. You've got some mandated by the Department of Labor, some are mandated, by the FLSA laws, some are mandated by the IRS, some are mandated by the immigration laws. And so, Department of Homeland Security. I mean, there's a bunch of different government websites just on the federal level. So if you reach out to us, we can send you a list based on your employee count in your state of which laws would apply to you. And then you can kind of research them individually on your own. But you're probably going to be going to about 10 or 15 different websites because unfortunately they're not all in one place because they are governed by different areas of the government.
Okay, and we have two other people. Raven and Michelle would like to get some more information on having us help them with this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gail has a question. Is any type of consideration required when you ask them to sign an updated acknowledgement form?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by
No.
consideration.
Um, I I'm not sure. You don't have to give them anything in exchange for signing it. It's just um, making sure that they get a copy and read it, and there's nothing that you need to give them in return except for continued employment,
Yeah, I mean, you can give them,
really.
30 days to read it. I think that's typically best practice too, is,
Yeah,
hey, guys, we're going to roll
yeah.
this out,
Hmm.
February 1st, and you have until March 1st to sign it. It's contingent upon employment. If you don't sign it by March 1st, you will be suspended and or terminated, depending on how your company wants to handle it. But other than that, I mean, as far as consideration goes, just as long as you provide adequate notice, that's really all you need. There's no other form of exchange, really, when it comes to that.
Right, and if they're not going to acknowledge receiving and reading your handbook, you have a bigger problem than you think you do.
Yeah.
Because you're just asking them to acknowledge that they understand your policies. Okay, I think that was all the questions, Brianna. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for your time today. Just as a quick announcement, next week, Kathy is going to be presenting on Are You Paying Overtime Correctly? And how to correctly calculate the regular rate of pay. So if you ever had any questions on how to pay overtime, calculate overtime, Kathy is going to go in depth on that next week for our webinar. So feel free to register and join us next week. We look forward to seeing you all there. Have a great day, guys.
Thank you.